Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome David Weil. He's a pulmonary and transplant physician. He's the author of the book, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. There's an excerpt from that book on Kevin MD. But David, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me again.
Now, we were just talking offline. You've been on several years ago. And for those who didn't listen to our first episode together, just briefly share your story and journey.
So the book is about my life as a transplant physician. I headed the lung transplant program at Stanford for most of my career, and it's about the emotional roller coaster of the ups and downs of doing that kind of work. So there's a lot of patient stories to be sure, but there's also a lot of stories about what the team goes through when they're trying to deliver this kind of care.
Perfect. So tell us this particular excerpt. You talked about a night at the ICU, and it gives us a real window in terms of what your life is like. But share the story.
Yeah, so in the book, what I wanted to do is go through the very real life drama of what happens when we transplant somebody. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it works not so well, and sometimes there's actually people on the waiting list that die. So I want to be sure that I tell all those kind of stories. And I think the excerpt you have is somebody that needed a second lung transplant and they were on the waiting list and just didn't make it in time. And so the conversations that I would have around those situations was really difficult, as you might imagine, just trying to explain all of this to the family and how invested we were as a team, and of course, how invested the family members are in seeing a good outcome. And that's just an example of the kind of stories I tell.
What makes transplant surgery different from other surgical subspecialties?
I think there are a lot of differences. I think that the mystique of it is certainly there. The magic of it is there. You can essentially, with one operation, take somebody from death's doorstep and turn their life around. We used to say at Stanford that it was the ultimate reset button. And what happens is it's a high risk game. And I think what maybe folks know about, maybe folks don't know about, is how often there things go wrong and there's moving parts to it, and it's a human endeavor, and I was one of the humans doing it. Not perfect, sometimes did a great job, sometimes not so good. And I think what I wanted the reader to know also, and I've had patients respond to this part of the book, is the doctors aren't robots. We're not out there just treating people, and if it works out, great. If it doesn't work out, that's okay too. We're actually human beings that a lot of times get very close to the patients that we take care of. And I think that was especially true in transplantation. A lot of medical subspecialties, you have a lot of patients. We had a lot of patients, but not so many that I couldn't know their family members, their dog's name, their kid's name, et cetera. So one of the things that drew me to the field was how close you get with the family members.
So give us a process of transplant. How long would you have to know this patient? How many times do you have to see this patient? Just take us through that general process of a patient going on a transplant list from beginning to end. Just give us an idea of the scope and how many times you have to see this patient to really get to know them.
Yeah, when I was at Stanford, we would evaluate about 300 patients a year for a lung transplant, and we would invite about half of those to actually come see us. So a lot of what I did as leader of the program was evaluate medical records and decide if it's a good idea for the patient to go through the workup. It's a 3-day, very intensive head to toe workup, and I didn't want to put anybody through that unless they had a realistic chance of getting a transplant. So a lot of what I did was selecting candidates for the waiting list. So after the 3-day evaluation, again, it's head to toe. We don't leave any stone unturned. There's a psychosocial component to it as well, just to make sure that the patient's up to getting this kind of care. We bring all that information to a meeting of the entire team, and sometimes we agreed on candidates, sometimes we didn't agree on candidates, and I show all of that in the book, what those discussions look like behind closed doors.
Yeah, so take us and to give us a little taste of some of those discussions. What's it like determining some of those ethical considerations in terms of who receives a transplant and who doesn't? Because it sounds like even the committee often doesn't agree on that.
Yeah, and we disagreed less on medical aspects, although sometimes a 70-year-old would come and see us, and folks were wondering what kind of 70-year-old it was. 70 years old is a very relative term. So sometimes we disagreed on medical aspects, but then there were other times we disagreed on what kind of patient, quote unquote, they are. Had they used drugs in the past? Were they compliant with their medical regimen? Were they likable? In fact, I'm afraid that some of those more subjective measures often came into the selection process as well, as much as we tried to keep that out.
Can you give us an example of one of these borderline gray area situations where it could be hypothetical or it could be an amalgamation of your experience? But I'm pretty interested in hearing an example of someone who was kind of in that gray area where it could have gone either way.
So some of the gray areas that we dealt with are people that had committed a crime, for instance, in the past, that served time in prison. Maybe they weren't as compliant with their medical regimen. Maybe they had abused substances. And we had to make judgments about whether or not that person deserved a second chance. And sometimes that's very difficult to determine, right? We don't really know. And sometimes we missed about whether or not a patient had reformed their life. And you got very strong opinions in the room. Some people, for instance, would say that if you served jail time and committed a felony, you should never get a transplant. Or if you were an undocumented person in our country, then you should never get a transplant. And, having practiced mostly in California, we had some people that were Mexican that had come across the border and were seeking a life-saving procedure. And whether or not that person should get a transplant in our healthcare system was a question we grappled with fairly regularly.
Now, are there any guidelines that help with their decision making? Like if you had a gray area case that went before your committee and then put them before another committee at another hospital, is it conceivable that you get two different outcomes?
You do, and that's a really good question. In fact, I wrote one of the recipient selection guidelines for our international society back in 2015. But there are these gray areas that the guidelines really don't dictate one path or the other. But we always, whenever we turned down a patient for transplant, would encourage them to go to a second center. We didn't have the corner on good judgment or the corner on that market. And so we would always say, look, we can't do the transplant here, but if you want to go to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, Seattle, wherever, then you should do that to get another opinion.
How is the decision ultimately made?
It really very rarely came down to actually a show of hands, but occasionally it would be a show of hands, where you'd actually vote on it. Most of the time, we could make a decision without having to go to that step, but sometimes we actually had to vote on it, and a lot of times it was quite a close vote.
And give us a sense of how big this committee was and who this committee comprised of.
It was a multidisciplinary team of physicians, surgeons, nurses, nurse practitioners, dietitians, nutritionists, social workers who were very important to the team. There were psychiatrists on the team, and everyone had a vote. Everyone had a say. With any large group, there were some people that were more influential than others in the group. But when we would sit down to meet, there were 40 or 50 people in the room.
Oh, and how long would these deliberations take for a typical gray area case?
Sometimes up to an hour. And, a lot of times when there's a very straightforward transplant recipient coming forward, we would decide in 15 seconds. And then other times it took a full hour to decide.
What would you say is the most challenging part of your job?
I think by far it's the patients that we lose on the waiting list, especially. I don't tolerate well the patients that die after the transplant. That's hard. But the patients that die on the waiting list that never got an opportunity to be transplanted, I think are especially hard on me and the rest of the team.
And where do you go for support? Because this isn't something that you've necessarily been trained for, like in residency and whatnot. And these decisions are life altering, obviously, for these patients. Like, do you have a place where you can talk to and kind of debrief once these decisions are made?
We really did not have that when I was at Stanford, which was too bad. I think COVID has actually brought to light the fact that we do need to talk to one another about what we're experiencing. So I think the situation's better now. I, for instance, would go to the gym or try to work out as hard as I can, ride my bike, do something to get my mind off of it. But I think it probably would have been better if we were able to talk to each other in a safe, open way.
So tell us about the state of transplant surgery today. What are some of the challenges facing the field today?
I think it's really exciting what's going on right now, and I think a lot of the excitement is about how we allocate organs in this country. I work with a company, in full disclosure, I serve on the board, called TransMedics, where we actually can move organs around the country, keep them alive, and actually take some of the logistical challenge of a transplant program, which has to be ready 24/7, 365, and deliver that organ right to the hospital's doorstep. So I think the biggest revolution that I see out there right now is keeping the transplant team in bed and at home as long as possible, and making the organ allocation process not so cumbersome, so work intensive to the transplant program. I think that's been a huge step.
Now, for those medical students who may be listening to you, what kind of characteristics or qualities should they have if they were to consider a career in transplant surgery?
Commitment. I think commitment is the absolutely required for our field.
So what
For
do you mean by
better,
that? Because
yeah,
I'm sure many surgical subspecialties
yeah.
it requires commitment. So like talk about specifically behind it.
Yeah, I think because the cases are not scheduled, they can happen anytime.
Yeah.
I think that there's really no off time per se. There's times when we may not be directly in the line of fire, but I think you have to understand that because transplant organs become available when they become available, and they're a precious resource, you have to pretty much be ready to go all the time. Now, that may sound awful to some of your listeners, but at the same time, the reward is tremendous. I can't think of another field where you get to see the impact of your work as starkly as you see it in this field.
Can you share with us one of your most rewarding cases?
I always look back to the cystic fibrosis patients that we transplanted. I even go back to the first patient I ever took care of after training, where we transplanted an 18-year-old who had never gotten a chance to breathe without oxygen, had cystic fibrosis, and in fact was able to run a 5-kilometer race just 6 months after transplant. I ran it with him. I won't tell you who ran faster that day, but it was amazing, where you take somebody that just didn't have a childhood essentially, and with this one operation we can turn things around.
So what are some of the other main messages that you want readers to come away with after reading your book?
I think in the book I talk a lot about, yes, transplant is a demanding field. Yes, we perform miracles, but things can go wrong. And try to be able to accept both, and also try to be more open about taking care of yourself in this field. I think even before COVID, I think transplant doctors had a pretty short career, at least clinically. They went on to do other things. Some of my mentors did that. But I think one of the messages of the book was, look, you can do this field, you can take care of patients, and you can take care of yourself. And to try to follow that example, it's critical to what we do, because we don't have enough transplant physicians and surgeons to go around right now.
We're talking to David Weil. He's a pulmonary and transplant physician, author of the book Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. David, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I think for all of the students and the early residents, and even the early practitioners, fully trained practitioners, talk to each other, stay connected to one another. The people that understand best what you're going through are the people you work with. When I made mistakes in my field and taking care of myself, it's when I became more isolated from my work colleagues. And don't do that. I am optimistic though that this generation of physicians is doing that a lot better than we did.
David, thank you so much for sharing your story time and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.